Games sell their audiences on a theme. The reason any game looks the way it does is to represent a particular theme. This theme might be one drenched in gritty realism where soldiers who kill and die are seen wearing the most legitimate looking uniforms of a real-world army. Or it might be a more whimsical theme where things can be a little goofier. It can be a multiplayer sandbox game or a single-player storyline, but in any case, proper respect for that theme is paramount. Consider the fact that Call of Duty now has Nicki Minaj as a playable character, in the form of a skin for multiplayer. Call of Duty has trended sillier over time, but for a game that was a sort of serious story about the faceless masses of men who fought in real wars, the transition to this makes me wonder where it all went wrong. Well, you might have something to say about how war is inherently trivialized by efforts to make a game out of it, or that letting people choose whatever stuff they want to wear is more important than some nebulous standard of realism, or that respawning and regenerating health serve to make these games silly to begin with. I just feel Call of Duty was a lot more respectable when at least the soldiers looked kind of legit. At least I could believe that these were opposing factions that had some reason to be killing each other, which lent some gravitas to the gameplay even if it was never super realistic. Throwing Nicki Minaj into the mix is indescribably bad. If you told the average gamer from 2005 about this kind of thing, if he believed you at all, he'd have some choice words, likely using the kind of vocabulary that gets videos demonetized in this brave new world. Call of Duty has undergone a sort of Fortnite-ification, and it's become embarrassing to observe. Theme is a critical factor in what attracts audiences to a game. Why do some people like World War II shooters while other people like modern ones, and still others prefer sci-fi shooters? One might say that these preferences are more related to gameplay factors that each period is associated with, but Battlefield 1 has shown us that you can give half the players automatic weapons and put tanks and close air support bombers everywhere, giving it gameplay that for all intents and purposes is more representative of a conventional World War II experience, and yet the allure of its unusual World War I setting was still a significant selling point that distinguished Battlefield 1, proof of the value that people place in theme. I need to make it clear that this issue isn't just about realism. It's about adherence to a consistent theme. A game's theme can be realistic, or it can be something entirely unrealistic, and either of those approaches can be a viable endeavor worth protecting. Thematic integrity can crumble from changes in the other direction, opposed to fantasy, where realistic elements like cool tactical firearm aesthetics are inserted into an established setting that is wrong for them. The reason someone might prefer one game over another might have as much to do with the choice of setting and, more pertinently to this conversation, how well that setting is portrayed. Many gamers would cite Call of Duty World at War as a better game than Call of Duty Vanguard. And this isn't just because you might say World at War is more fun to play in 2025, but it's more so because of how brilliantly World at War presented its theme. Whereas Call of Duty Vanguard used the theme it sold everyone on as a vague aesthetic that it barely committed to. This is a skin you can wear in Call of Duty Vanguard, a World War II game. This might look okay in, Fortnite or something, and I mean that sincerely, but in the more grounded and supposedly serious World War II setting that Call of Duty Vanguard is built around, this is grossly unfitting. And I want to briefly note that they don't ever show stuff like this in, the gameplay reveal trailers. No, those look suitably at least World War II-esque. They hit you with this stuff later, and it feels kind of misleading. Right now, the most prevalent risk factors against a strongly maintained visual theme tend to be cosmetics and crossovers. Crossovers can kill a game's identity quickly and decisively by flooding it with outside elements that don't really belong. Even Fortnite originally had its own strong identity, but now it's pretty much just recognized as an assortment of crossovers. But the bigger problem driving this trend of thematic degeneration is purchasable cosmetic items. Cosmetics in games are not inherently bad. They can be a really cool way to distinguish your guy and give you something to grind for without putting you at a disadvantage advantage for lack of it. But it's important to recognize that personal distinctions can come at the cost of a game's own distinct identity. You might say cosmetics are good because they offer player expression, and more options are always better when they don't harm gameplay. This player expression, fun though it may be, comes at the cost of any kind of representation. To make it clear why I have an issue with this at all, imagine a World War II flick that looked the way modern cosmetic-driven mishmash games tend to. Imagine Saving Private Ryan's beach scene, but instead of everybody looking like a normal, generic soldier, you've got Nicki Minaj running around on the beach doing the things that she's known for. Some of the soldiers have like animated CGI flame patterns on their guns. A couple of the people are cat ear cyborgs from space. You get the picture. And then, the movie plays out the exact same way, hitting the same tonal notes of the horror and confusion of the Normandy landings, and it's all supposedly serious. That would be pretty stupid, right? People would scorn that. So why is it different with games? Why does the audience here accept that level of nonsense? The image I conjured is not really an exaggeration of the kind of scene you see in these games. Games go for a serious, maybe even reverent tone. They claim to be pursuing authenticity. They say this is dedicated to the brave veterans of World War II or something. Then you play it and you got some cute little floral pattern on your gun. And this sort of thing puts a game totally at odds with itself, and these aesthetic elements betray the tone. Everybody seems to agree that immersion is an important factor in games, and yet there's so little pushback against this giant sledgehammer being used to gracelessly shatter that immersion across all sorts of games. It's strange how tolerant we are of the most unfitting visual elements when they happen to be customization options for multiplayer. The sort of thing doesn't fly in a single-player campaign. A good litmus test is to imagine if these options were used for the protagonist of a story-based game. If it would look goofy and misplaced for single player, then why should multiplayer portrayals get a free pass? There are some inevitable problems when it comes to multiplayer. Player conduct is going to betray a theme. Gamers are going to be silly even in a serious setting. People are going to say all sorts of unfitting things in voice chat. Multiplayer PvP battlegrounds tend to demand less authenticity than an actual story. This is true, but only to an extent. This doesn't justify abandoning any semblance of the premise of the game. Why don't we have campaigns where people erupt in funny particle effects on death? Where the villain draws a gun on you, but it has a little teddy bear keychain and a custom decal on it that looks so cool? Well, we know that would be silly and out of place and would betray the narrative, of course. It would take you out of the moment and ruin that precious immersion. I just don't see why any reservations we have against that sort of visual incongruity are lifted just because we've entered a multiplayer arena. Aesthetic dissonance is not the only problem facing thematic integrity. I'd say it's the most widespread right now for how relatively unchallenged it is. Themes can come apart due to writing conventions changing, moral sensibilities shifting, audience expectations differing, or just the composition of the development team becoming different. You can lose a theme for all sorts of reasons. What I'm focusing on right now is what I'd call aesthetic dissonance, where the visual cohesion is muddied. What sets this apart from the other issues is that this is pretty hard to find excuses for. It's not easy to consistently output great stories that adhere to a particular vision, especially when the landscape of culture has changed a lot. But it is easy to not throw in a magical unicorn accessory with your gritty realistic shooter where people die horribly. It might seem tempting to say that this is an easily avoidable mistake, but I'd say it's more like a well-calculated decision made for the sake of profit. I want to emphasize that this degradation is not usually an immediate shift. It's usually more pernicious. When we went from the beautiful, authentic enough looking multiplayer characters from Black Ops 1 to, well, whatever we have now, that shift did not happen in a single year. But in the end, you get to a point where pretty much everybody is going to look back and go, what the heck happened? Often when microtransactions appear, people are assuaged by the argument, what does it matter as long as it's just cosmetic? As long as it's not pay to win, it doesn't matter what a game offers for money, it's merely a way to support developers. And that's a fair argument in vacuum, but having cosmetics on an in-game marketplace is often the first step that provides a financial incentive for a company to erode its own game's carefully crafted theme. The outlandish and bizarre nature of these cosmetics is actually directly tied to that financial incentive. After all, anything that looks too ordinary to the setting won't stand out. But what if you can make your Halo Spartan look like a samurai or a knight? That way you can really stand out from the crowd. You can be extraordinary, and that's something people are always willing to spend money on. The effect is significantly amplified in a live service game as new additions to the cosmetic marketplace have to compete with long-standing former offerings, so there's often a trend of things getting crazier and crazier later into a live service game's lifetime, as they bring out the big guns to attract people who have already bought all the relatively mundane offerings or want to stand out from those who have. And with games like Call of Duty even having certain offerings carry forward between games staying on your account, you have years of cosmetic content that's already established, so you need something new and groundbreaking. When everybody's bought the soldier gear that they like, you gotta throw in celebrities or furries, just do anything, no one's gonna push back. I don't mean to sound as if any deviation from an established theme is some great crime. There's obviously a spectrum to it, but I'm sure many of us can agree that there's a limit to how far you can go, and that limit has often gone broken. Small encroachments on a theme can end up being the breach that leads to a total abandonment when games can be updated out of bearing that standard. If I were to assess how things got to this point, Team Fortress 2 is a great example, because while its theme isn't the most profound, it was always pretty goofy. It saw a gradual shift that acts as both a model of the pattern that many games exhibit over their life cycle, and it also occurred over such a prolonged period of time, since Team Fortress 2 was such a long-lasting game, that it acts as sort of a microcosm for general industry trends of thematic erosion. It started with no cosmetics to speak of, they were added in a later update. In this original incarnation, Valve famously put tremendous thought and effort into making each team and class instantaneously discernible, and the game did have a specific Cold War era mercenary vibe to it. Team Fortress 2 started with just the hats, and most were cosmetics that looked like some form of mercenary attire, or at least something befitting the character behind the class. Like, oh, Scout can get baseball gear. Sure, why not? Gradually, any thematic requirements for new cosmetics became less important. What's really interesting to me is that TF2 had a specific Halloween theme event item category whose cosmetics would be hidden for most of the year. And to any who say TF2 is such a silly game,
Thanks, Pally. All right, I'll feel good.
it doesn't need to commit to a theme. I ask you, why would they do this? Why would they keep some of the craziest cosmetics limited to this Halloween event period? It must be because they understood that those cosmetics would fall outside the bounds of the game's usual theme. But the fact that they made this distinction is rather strange at this point in time, when a lot of the Halloween event items are pretty tame compared to some of the stuff that's available year-round. Unfitting cosmetics have become relatively common in TF2, yet these Halloween items are the only things that are restricted in this way. Where there once seemed to be clearly established rules governing the limits of these cosmetics, nowadays it seems that there are no boundaries. All across the industry in those same years, cosmetics have gone haywire, gradually escalating with the science of extracting money from consumers, advancing beyond our reckoning, and governing decisions on what kinds of cosmetics are to be included in games. And now it seems that every game is trying to be Fortnite. That's the point of convergence for any sufficiently profit-seeking game. Games like Halo and Call of Duty had an established history of cosmetic options before this stuff went completely off the rails. Some were garish, but they didn't become so commonly at odds with their series styles until the cosmetics started to become linked to real money. This led to a cascading effect as the cosmetics are competing for impulse, much like YouTube thumbnails, and you can see how that has a way of becoming a race to the bottom. But you can't really argue with results, and developers know what gets them money. And the other side of the profit incentive is that they are, in fact, giving people exactly what they want. So there's only two ways this thematic degradation stops. Either developers are unusually committed to maintaining their themes directly in the face of that profit, just leaving the money on the table, or players just stop wanting animated dragons on neon glowing guns in every single game they play, which apparently isn't going to happen. I don't really expect this to get much better unless developers really start to lose audience interest due to these kinds of things. And that's a problem because when you start having the cosmetics like this in every single game, the result is a homogenizing effect, as every game has the same kinds of garish, out-of-place, goofy stuff, not only eroding the identity of the game itself by diminishing its original pretense, its theme, but also blurring any distinction between it and other games as they all adopt the same patterns. Just look at how similar games like Call of Duty, Apex Legends, and Fortnite are starting to appear. The distinctions have blurred, and I feel that these are games that have no right to look similar at all. Call of Duty was always a more serious game than Fortnite. It was always more committed to a particular theme. The fact that these games are starting to converge on the same aesthetic principles is pretty ugly in my opinion. And I say this as someone who doesn't really have that common revulsion a lot of people my age do towards Fortnite. Not that I'm a fan, but I respect it enough. It was always its own thing. But so was Call of Duty, and now they're the same thing, and it sucks. There's a massive juxtaposition between cosmetics and the supposed subject matter in so many of these games. It's like mixing paint colors. You don't get something beautiful out of it, you just get a wider catalog of monotony. I oppose these trends for the same reason I don't think something like Saving Private Ryan or Black Hawk Down should be styled like an Adam Sandler movie. Some things don't mix. I want to acknowledge some objections to my perspective. I don't mean to set these up to be deliberate weak strawmen, but instead just things I'd better acknowledge to cover my bases. Firstly, more options is more fun. Don't gatekeep fun. As I mentioned earlier, it's not fair to blow off any complaints about aesthetic being sacrificed for the sake of player expression. The more stuff is better argument might make individual players who like cosmetics feel validated, but things deteriorate in the bigger picture. In Battlefield 3, while you can nitpick about a lot of stuff, it's not as if the gameplay is truly realistic after all. It really does tend to look like a grounded cinematic game. No one is wearing goofy custom kits. Then you have Battlefield 5 where the silliest cosmetics were shown off unabashedly in the trailer and people were annoyed. They were met with an upfront demonstration of a lack of thematic commitment, and they were immediately alienated. Battlefield 5 got a lot of negative backlash early on, and most of that was independent of any concerns of gameplay. It was all about the theme. That's something people do treasure. While games often have their shortcomings as far as cinematic appearance goes, stiff animations, duplicate faces, and so on, in a game like Battlefield 3, if you zoom out a little and appreciate what they were going for, it's all cohesive. It really does look great. Not as true in Battlefield 5, where you get that sort of hodgepodge effect. Customization can be fun. There can even be a balanced form of it where authentic-looking additions are available. But it's absolutely not a worthwhile endeavor if the aesthetic that a game promises is completely abandoned for its inclusion. Not only does it damage that sense of authenticity, it also homogenizes games. When every game decides to give players every possible option and you have animated dragon skins in all of them, it doesn't make any game unique, it makes them generic. A rigid commitment to the setting is a more distinct and braver choice at this point. Look at Isanzo, a game with a ton of customization options available. While some look a little silly, none of them tarnish the game's principal aesthetic. They attained the best of both worlds. Players are free to express themselves in various ways, but it's all within the clear boundaries you'd expect from the chosen setting. These cosmetics emphasize the theme rather than detracting from it. You can make your guy distinct, but he's always going to look like he belongs in the Alps during World War I. This is the type of customization games should strive for. Another thing people might say is fantasy has no rules. People who broadly agree with me often draw the line when the subject matter is more fantastical, like when it's a sci-fi setting or fantasy, something not set in, say, a real war but in a fictional universe. Then you can do whatever you want. And I'd beg to differ. It's still important for a fictional universe to bear some standard of internal consistency and visual coherence, although you do have a lot more freedom in creativity. A great example of this would be what has happened to Halo's multiplayer. Cosmetics trickled in slowly, but for the most part they had two key differences from the later iterations. First of all, multiplayer was completely divorced from the story. There was no pretension that anything was canon in the multiplayer realm, and that probably included the Ninja Gaiden armor. Now, in an era with far more outlandish Spartan attire, it's been expanded such that the multiplayer is a simulation that is actually happening in universe. This goes hand in hand with the fact that cosmetics are far less modest and grounded than they used to be. As the armor started to become linked to monetary purchases, it started to look progressively unlike Halo. Now I can't tell you what a Spartan looks like because they're just a smattering of every possible shape you can imagine. That's the kind of thing that makes it harder to take a universe seriously, when it becomes anything goes and there's a total lack of consistency. Fantasy does have boundaries. If you were playing a Lord of the Rings adaptation with a Kabar knife with US Army written on it, I would not have it if somebody tried to tell me, oh, it's magical fantasy land, so who cares about some unrealistic visual asset? No, that would be ridiculous and inexcusable. Finally, one might say games are a different medium. Some might rebuke my comparison to movies and say that because games are a different medium, the scrutiny applied to movies is not fairly applied to games. From that perspective, there's no sense in guarding against this aesthetic drift when players can do such things as teabag their opponents or commit war crimes while representing real historical military units, and other unsightly things. And what does any of this matter if you're supposedly trying to represent the horrors of war? You're met with a respawn screen whenever you pay the ultimate price. Why hold games to such a standard with all that in mind? And I'll say, sure, there are some unavoidable weaknesses of the medium that prevent games from attaining thematic perfection. But my standards aren't that unreasonably high. Just because there are some unavoidable pitfalls doesn't mean we have to voluntarily walk into every single one. Precedent for faulty representation doesn't really justify foregoing any commitment to a theme. There can still be strong reasons to make up for a game's inherent lack of realism whenever possible. And of course, I don't mean to generalize gamers. I'm sure some will agree and some will disagree with me on this. While I might sound bitter, I don't hold people in contempt for seeking different things in a game than I do. There are people who care strongly about theme as I do, and there are people who don't and just want to wear whatever they want all the time. Ideally, both of us would be able to have our pick of games and we wouldn't have any reason to resent each other's preferences. Unfortunately, the long-established, thematically committed franchises have all been appropriated, transformed into something unrecognizable in the hunt for an audience that wants the anything-goes, crazy, immersion-shattering cosmetic stuff. And so we're kind of at odds. It feels like my preferences are being encroached upon and driven out of existence. I feel that this stuff is really damaging. It doesn't matter if it might not affect gameplay. A lot of effort goes into crafting immersive worlds for the sake of demonstrating a particular theme. And time after time, whether it's happening to a long-established franchise or a game adding some DLC later, all that effort comes unwound. Any sense of authenticity is sacrificed for extravagant cosmetic options or unfitting crossovers. The end result of this is going to be games getting increasingly outlandish, ultimately defeating their own premises, and making them all look like the same slurry of nonsense, instead of having any kind of tone-fitting aesthetic.